Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner from the Break It Down Show, coming at you with today's introduction for author Michael Guardia on his return visit. We've had a bunch of new guests recently, so I thought we'd bring back someone from the past. Michael is an internationally recognized author and military historian. He's a veteran of the United States Army, serving 6 years in active duty as an armor officer. He's written about Hal Moore, leadership, and today's book that he's going to talk about is his latest. It's sort of a biography of the F-14 Tomcat. So basically, he's taking the history of the Tomcat and telling it for us so we can all learn about this fantastic and maybe the sexiest airplane ever. That twin rudder design is just, I love it. I think you guys will get a kick out of this. I'll keep this one pretty short. Standard things apply. Subscribe, rate, review, share the show. That would really be a big help. And savethebrave.org. Click on donate. Hit a monthly amount, or do your annual giving right now and just drop $100, $500. If you want to donate land, your time, your capability, we're interested in all of it. Reach out. Let me know how it goes. You can get me at Pete A. Turner on all social media, or just Pete at breakitdownshow.com. I want to hear from you. Let's do this. Mike Guardia, come on up.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Mike Guardia, author of Tomcat Fury, and you are listening to the Break It Down Show with Pete Turner.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Hey man, thanks for coming on. I appreciate you sending me the book, which in all honesty, I have not had a chance to get through yet. But I am fascinated by this. And you know, as a kid that grew up in the 80s, the Tomcat was a big plane in my youth. You know, we watched Top Gun and Iron Eagle. And for a while, jet fighter movies were really a thing. And so the Tomcat and the other, F-Series fighters they were burned into our heads, and we wanted to become fighter jocks, man. So I appreciate you doing this. I guess you would call it a biography of these things.
Right on.
So what drew you to the story?
Well, there were a lot of things that drew me to the Tomcat initially. I think, like most people within our age bracket, my introduction to the F-14 was Top Gun with Tom Cruise, and just the way that the movie was made and the way that it was presented really burned the images of the F-14 into my mind. And of all the planes that have been in naval service, the Tomcat really just has a sleek look to it. It has a bunch of panache, and it has a lot of glory and glamour attached to it, not simply by virtue of movies like Top Gun and The Final Countdown and Executive Decision, but just its illustrious combat history. And I think by virtue of that alone, it really deserved a book that gave an expose of all of its highlighted combat engagements, not just in U.S. service, but in Iranian service as well, because the Republic of Iran, it remains the only foreign operator of the Tomcat, and they're the only ones in the world that still have an active Tomcat.
Really? Okay. Well, let's dive right in there, because that's fascinating, especially given Iran and America's contentious relationship right now. So expand more on that, if you would.
Absolutely. So let's wind the clocks back to 1972. This was in the dying days of Vietnam for us. And it was clear by this point that we really needed to have a better fighter jet in our inventory. And for years at this point, we had been relying on the F-4 Phantom, which was a very good plane used by both the Navy and the Air Force. But it became clear that it really couldn't compete with a lot of the latter-day Soviet MiGs that were coming online. So the Navy and the Air Force got together and they said, look, we've had a pretty good run with the F-4 Phantom, but having a one-size-fits-all plane for all three services, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps, it really just isn't doing what we thought it would. So the Navy really needs its own plane that's designed for carrier operations, and that was the birth of the F-14. Meanwhile, the Air Force went on to the F-15. But right around this time, the Shah of Iran, who had been a pilot himself, wanted to make Iran the heavy power player in the affairs of the Middle East. And he said, okay, well, the only way I can really do that is by countering the growing threat that I see from Iraq, because Saddam Hussein and the Shah of Iran, it was no big secret that those two did not like each other. And as Saddam was getting more and more equipment from the Soviet Union, the Shah of Iran said, okay, well, let me go knocking on Richard Nixon's door and see what he has to offer me. Now, Nixon knew that Iran was a very close ally at the time. In fact, back then, we had no closer ally in the Middle East than Iran. And he said, well, you know what, to keep ties strong and to keep you as a strategic ally against the Soviet Union, I'm going to give you free reign of anything you want in the U.S. arsenal. I'm essentially going to give you everything short of the atomic bomb.
Wow.
And the Shah of Iran said, okay, well, what can you tell me about this new F-14 Tomcat? I'm hearing a lot of good things about it. And he had a bunch of Iranian pilots test fly it. And hands down, of all the jets that the Iranian pilots test flew, the F-14 was their heavy favorite. And orders were made during the reign of the Shah for 80 Tomcats to be delivered to the Iranian Air Force. 79 of them were ultimately delivered. And the Shah of Iran made it no secret how much he really loved the F-14 and how he thought that this was the best available fighter to defend the skies of Iran. Well, just a few years later, the Shah abdicates his throne in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini takes over, and the Ayatollah essentially kicks out all of the Gruman and all of the U.S. Navy advisors and has a fleet of Tomcats on his hand that he doesn't know what to do with. And he takes a lot of the best Tomcat pilots and he throws them in jail for being loyal to the Shah. But surprise, surprise, in 1980, Iraq invades Iran. And now that Iran is on the defensive, the Ayatollah empties his prison and says, hey guys, sorry that I threw you in jail, but I need your expertise to fly these F-14s.
Hey, this is P.J. Turner from the Break It Down Show, checking in real quick to ask you this. John, Scott, and I all support Save the Brave with our time, our location, our effort, and our money. Each month we give a small amount. Do the same with us. Go to SaveTheBrave.org, click on the Donate tab, pick an amount that you want to come out each month, and they will handle all the rest. I stand behind these folks. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the show.
Hey guys, sorry that I threw you in jail, but I need your expertise to fly these F-14s. And those pilots were released from jail. They were restored to flight status the very same day. And a lot of them, after the war ended, they fled Iran just to get away from the Ayatollah.
Huh. Okay, let me back up first off, because I want to understand some differences. What is the difference between an F-14 and an F-15? Because as an Army guy, to my untrained Air Force eyes, I don't know like what the difference is. Is it just branch or what makes the F-14 different than the F-15?
Okay. Well, the F-14 was manufactured by Gruman Aerospace. The F-15 was made by McDonnell Douglas.
Okay.
The F-14 is a standard two-seat fighter with an adjustable swing wing design. And it is designed mostly for carrier operations, designed to protect the parent fleet from any aerial threats. Whereas the F-15 is an exclusive Air Force fighter, standard one-seater, although a two-seat variant is also out there. It's primarily a one-seat fighter jet.
Okay.
It's designed specifically for air superiority. Wasn't really conceived with a ground attack capability in mind, although it was later adapted to that use.
So is it that when the government put out the competition for the contract, the two planes were born with similar specs in terms of how they look by having, twin rudders and all that kind of thing? Or twin tail wings or tail fins, I guess you call it. Is that what it is? And they're like, hey, the Air Force, we like this one. We want this. And the Navy said, hey, this other one will work great on our carrier, so we'll take the F-14 instead.
Well, pretty much both the Navy and the Air Force, they sat down and they thought of their different requirements. And then they put those requirements out to the DoD and then out to the various aerospace companies.
Right.
And the Navy said, okay, well, here's what we're looking for. And the Air Force said, here's what we're looking for. Now, of all you aerospace giants out there, to include Northrop and Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, which eventually got dissolved into Boeing, they said, here's what we're looking for. What designs can you guys give us? And all the aerospace manufacturers that responded to that inquiry said, well, okay, we think we can give you something that matches what you're looking for. Here's this design. How do you like it? And pick and choose what designs you think you want or tell us how to make it better. That's when they ultimately selected Gruman and McDonnell Douglas to respectively make the F-14 and the F-15.
Got you. Okay. Yeah, that helps clear that up because I know they look similar, but I don't know, maybe they're at best cousins. So let's go back to Iran. So the Ayatollah lets these pilots out and they're going to go fight in the war. What kind of force did they face in Iraq? Like, what did they have in the air?
So in the opening days of the air war, you really had an example of American planes fighting Soviet-made aircraft, and the irony, the geopolitical irony, as it was not lost on anybody in the West because they were looking at the air war over Iran and Iraq and saying to themselves, okay, well, now we're seeing just how well these American-built jets are competing against the Soviet-built jets, because the Iranians had the F-4 Phantom and the F-14 Tomcat, whereas the Iraqis were fielding the MiG-23 and the MiG-25. And it was in many ways was a blessing for Iran because in aerial battles, both large and small, the F-14 bested the competition every time. And there was not a single MiG. There's not a single MiG or a single Sukhoi jet that the Iraqis put up that could stand toe-to-toe against the F-14.
Is it because of its long-range capability or its dogfighting or sort of a combination of both?
It was really a combination of both. And, the F-14 had a much greater endurance than either the MiG-23 or the MiG-25. And, it was far more maneuverable than either one of those. Pretty much by the end of the 1980s, as more pilots had gone up against the MiG-23, general consensus among pretty much every Air Force in the West was, hey, the MiG-23 is a maneuvering dog. I mean, it's absolute garbage.
Huh. Wow. Yeah. And okay, so it's one thing for the pilots to say that, but I mean, did the MiG-23 really across the board suffer? I mean, obviously here in Iran and Iraq, but you've got maybe two different levels of fighter pilots too. I guess Iran's fighter pilots spent a lot of time in jail between, getting imprisoned and getting into the airplane. But is there an actual difference worldwide that we see that the 23 just didn't perform as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The same scenario played out in the Arab-Israeli air wars as well throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. You had several Syrian and several Egyptian MiG-23s who were very easy prey for the Israeli jets. And oddly enough, the Israelis were also piloting the F-4 Phantom and the F-15 Eagle.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you get on this story? Obviously you've written about Hal Moore and leadership and that kind of thing. And although these are military topics, this seems completely different than the Hal Moore type thing.
Absolutely. I'm really not known for writing books about aviation, but this one drew me in. And the best explanation I can give is probably just because the F-14 was such a big part of pop culture when I was growing up, in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was this nagging sense that I just had to write a book about it. I think it really just boils down to, man, I'm fascinated and I just can't suppress the itch to write about this.
Yeah. And then how did you go about the process of gathering all this? Are there certain experts in the field? Were you going over to the aerospace folks, or where did your work lead you?
My work took me to a lot of places. There are quite a few aviation experts, also a lot of aviation journalists who have studied, and they've also done check rides on the Tomcat. They were incredibly helpful. Also being able to track down and interview pilots who had actually flown her in combat missions. They were never at a loss for stories and never at a loss for enthusiasm to share their stories.
Huh. What kind of stories did you gather from these guys? Because, I know I've watched like the History Channel, and they'll talk about the F-4 and everybody raves about it, and what a great airplane it was. And I get the sense that Tomcat has the same kind of pedigree from its pilots. So what did you gather along the way?
Well, there was an immense amount of pride in the aircraft. I remember hearing from one particular pilot that the Tomcat was the plane that he fell in love with. And he said, every pilot at some point in their career has an airplane that they just fall in love with. And for me, that was the F-14 Tomcat. He said, of the different planes that I've flown, the Tomcat had the best look, it was sleek, and it was the most aerodynamic any plane that I flew. And aside from the immense pride that they have in their aircraft, you also get a sense that they were very proud of the versatility of missions that the Tomcat handled. On the one end, the Tomcat was really designed to be an air superiority fighter, which it was in spades. But at the same time, it could handle air-to-ground missions on par with even the best jets in the U.S. arsenal.
So at some point, the Tomcat falls out of favor. I mean, it's still in use today, if I'm not mistaken, but newer planes come along, stealth technology, better radar, better, AI to help the pilot lock onto something, that kind of thing. So when does the Tomcat start to show age, and how long do they project that it will be in service still?
The Tomcat was a real diehard, and there were a lot of folks in the naval aviation community who went down swinging trying to keep the plane in naval service. The downfall of the Tomcat, oddly enough, was right around the mid-'90s, and before he was our vice president, Dick Cheney, he was our Secretary of Defense. He was one of the advocates against the Tomcat, oddly enough, saying that it was 1960s technology. And at one point, he even called it little more than a jobs program. And he said, why do we have to spend the money to keep all these F-14s in the air when it seems like the F-18 can do just as good a job and it costs less to produce each one? Well, if you're looking at it strictly from a numbers-based standpoint and you're just worried about the bottom line, the argument makes sense. But the naval aviation community fought back pretty hard on that. And they said, look, Mr. Secretary, this F-14 can stay in the air longer than the F-18 can, and it is pound for pound the most versatile jet that we have in our carrier air fleets today. Let's keep this going forward and keep it in the air for as long as we can. And just to show you that we're serious, hey, long after your tenure of Secretary of Defense is over, we're going to show just how versatile it is in whatever upcoming conflicts that we have. Well, knock on wood, that's right around the time that the war in Bosnia kicks off, and the Tomcat does an incredible job servicing ground targets, not only in that war, but in the opening days of the war in Afghanistan and the second war in Iraq. It's an incredible asset as far as supporting troops on the ground, which in our current constructs of warfare is really what planes should be the most focused on. But the die had been cast, and both you and I know how the DoD operates.
Yeah.
And if they're looking for a way to cut costs and save money, then they're going to pursue it. So the Tomcat was retired back in 2006 from U.S. Naval Service, and the F-18 ultimately took over the role of both a fighter and an attack aircraft. And today, the only country in the world that still has an operational fleet of Tomcats is Iran. And being that they kicked out all of the technical expertise that could show them how to maintain their fleets, Iran has barely like 24 Tomcats that are still flyable.
Oh, no kidding. And is it the backbone of their air superiority force?
Well, it's not so much the backbone anymore. I mean, it certainly was throughout the Iran-Iraq war. They've found new allies out in the world, and they've since gotten a few MiG-29s, and I think they got a few Sukhoi Su-35s on the books now. But for the few Tomcats that do remain operational, Iran is doing everything they can to try and keep them in the sky, because they know, hey, it's a great asset that we really don't want to lose if we don't have to.
So a country that wants to buy Tomcats, like let's say, I don't know, Namibia, that Namibia Air Force wants to buy some, can they put in an order for Tomcats? Are they still capable of being made by somebody?
No, unfortunately not. Let's see, Gruman Aerospace, they merged with Northrop, and they shut down the F-14 assembly line. I want to say it's been at least 20 years now. And to prevent any of the surplus Tomcats that we had in the States, to prevent them from falling into the hands of third-party black market arms dealers, the DoD hired a private contractor to shred every last Tomcat that we had here in the States.
Shred it. Tell me about that.
Okay, so I kid you not, this third-party contractor, it was a scrap metal recycling company. They went around to every single boneyard in the U.S. and took an existing Tomcat that was just sitting there on the tarmac and put it through a metal shredder. And on the other end of that shredder, all the little bits and pieces of the Tomcat came out in these 2-inch by 2-inch cubes of scrap metal that were later smelted and used to make other things, probably toasters or some stuff.
That is incredible. So, but I mean, surely there are some left in some museums or on some, like if you go to any kind of military post, you and I both know, like, hey, there's an airplane. There's always an airplane around somewhere.
Oh, of course. So they salvaged a few of them just to be on display. I know one is on display at the Air and Space Museum. There's another one that's on display outside of Dallas International Airport. And there's one that's at the Boneyard at Hoffman Air Force Base. And that one is being prepped for another museum location. So in total, there are about a handful of Tomcats that are preserved and on display. But those handful of display items are the only ones that survive.
And what do the lovers of the Tomcat have to say about that? Like, I mean, obviously the door is shut, sealed, and they've destroyed what they can of the plane. How does the Navy pilot community feel about all that?
They're still very heartbroken about it. You'll find at least half a dozen naval pilots on any forum out there, or even if you talk to them, and they say that one of the biggest mistakes that the Defense Department ever made was retiring the Tomcat too early. Because the plane still had a lot of life left in it. And they said that, if the Air Force wants to keep the F-15 in service out to the year 2025, there was no reason why the Navy couldn't do likewise with the F-14.
And so what replaces the Tomcat?
Well, for the past 20 years or so, really it's the F-18 that's been taking the lead as far as naval air operations go. And that's really been the only thing that's replaced it. Of course, there's the long-standing wait on this new F-35 Joint Strike Fighter.
Right.
Still really hasn't come to fruition the way folks have anticipated it would. But in the coming years, and hopefully not the coming decades, we'll finally see the F-35 come online as the Joint Strike Fighter that everyone says it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, and the F-22 is up there doing things, and there's a lot of other platforms that perform. Can you give us an idea? Because I'm always fascinated by this. From someone saying, what's the 6th generation fighter going to be? And then the military starts to think up the capabilities that it wants. How long, and now we're trying to figure this F-35 out. It took, and you've written a lot of different military books. You've got a lot of knowledge on this kind of topics, but it took us a while to sort out the Osprey. How long, the F next? How long does that process take?
Well, it's probably going to take another 20 years. If I had to take a stab at it, I'd say it's going to be another 2 decades or so before we really start to see the prototypes or the first placements of the next generation fighter. I mean, there are exceptions to this rule, but typically what I've noticed is it's about a 20 to a 25-year iteration for a new fighter to come online, reach the so-called peak of its service life, and then, start to take a back seat as more and more advanced aircraft come online. That was pretty much what happened with the F-4, also with the F-5. The F-15 is the one notable exception. Here it is past the age of 40 and it's still going strong.
Yeah, they just keep throwing a new letter behind it. The F-15 Juliet, or whatever iteration they're on. When we look at these multi-decade processes and we see, the F-14 die out and the F-15 win, again, they're sort of related in their timeline. What is it about what the Air Force did with it versus what the Navy did that makes the F-15 capable of, continuing to, add new capabilities and remain in service?
Well, I think the Air Force really just saw the F-15 as a long-term investment, and they really wanted to hold strong to it.
Hey, this is P.A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
I think the Air Force really just saw the F-15 as a long-term investment, and they really wanted to hold strong to it. I've never flown an F-15 or an F-14, but the pilots who have left their experiences recorded for all of us to view, the pilots who have flown both have actually said that the F-14 was the more maneuverable jet.
Huh.
Now, I'm sure that there are probably at least half a dozen F-15 pilots out there who would disagree with me strongly on that, would probably be up in arms if they heard me say that. But just the pilots whose accounts I've read, having flown both airplanes, said that at low-level dogfights, the F-14 was actually their favorite. So I think one of the reasons why the F-15 stuck around, or has stuck around for as long as it has, I mean, not only because it is an incredible fighter, but also I think because the Air Force really, I think they had more leeway and they had more flexibility and more room to argue that we need to extend the life of this air superiority fighter. And they had a lot of data points to point to, because the F-15, as it is right now, remains the only fighter in American service to have never been lost to any type of enemy fire.
Wow.
It has an undefeated record, not only in Desert Storm, but in the Balkans and even in the air wars over Israel and the Arab world. It remains the undefeated heavyweight champion of fighter jets. So I think the Air Force, when, if ever there was a time when the F-15 was examined to be put on the chopping block, they stood up and said, well, hey, we have something that the other services don't. We have this fighter jet that has never been lost to enemy fire.
Right.
So we'll be sabotaging national security if you even think about if you think about doing away with this.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. Like, it's undefeated and everything else. Maybe you don't know the answer to this, but is the F-5 still in service anywhere in the world? Like, that's an old plane. I mean, that thing was designed, had to be in the 50s. I mean, it's the progeny of prop aircraft. So and there were so many F-5s. Is it still in service anywhere?
The F-5, I think it's still in service as a trainer.
Okay.
Yeah, in American service, I think, I could be wrong on this, but I think it's still in service as a trainer. And the F-5 active fleet, you know what? Oddly enough, I think Iran is still one of the only countries that has an active front-line fleet of F-5s.
When you think about that, like, because I don't know how old F-5s are, but just by numbers, F-4, F-5, F-16, F-35, like, we're way down the road now, like it's been a long time. Even like the U-2 is still flown. And that thing is, what is that thing? 60 years old, almost 70 years old now at this point.
Oh goodness, at least.
Yeah. I guess it is a little weird that the F-14 doesn't survive the cut, but there's a lot of airplanes out there that do a lot of different things. Like the Air Force has the A-10, and they're always battling with what to do with that thing. And I'll tell you, and I don't know about you, but as a ground guy, having a helicopter on station or an A-10 up above, it chills the enemy out. Like, they don't they don't want any part of that thing. Yet the Air Force is always trying to kill it. It's so dominant when it's in the air.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no question in my mind that the A-10, I mean, is really the king of close air support. And they've actually been trying to kill it for a while now, and it keeps hanging on to its life. And, I actually think that that's a blessing, not only for the Air Force, but for every Army and Marine ground pounder that plane supports.
Yeah. When we look at the life history of the Tomcat, and we get a chance to recognize how good it was, its cousin, the F-15, never gets shot down. Have any Tomcats ever been shot down?
Sadly, yes. We lost one to a surface-to-air ground missile.
Okay.
It was a SAM that shot down one F-14 right in the middle of Desert Storm. That's an incident that I actually talk about in the book. Both pilots ended up surviving the attack. They both ejected. One was rescued promptly by Air Force Heliborne Rescue Squad, but the other crewman, the radar intercept officer, he was captured by the Iraqis, ended up being an Iraqi POW for something to the effect of 6 weeks before they let him out.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. So when we look at the history of American fighter pilots after, say, like Vietnam, we haven't lost that many planes in general. I mean, I know like Scott O'Grady got shot out of the sky, but a lot of these things are these things pilot error, or is it just because you're in combat and, they've got missiles and a shot at it?
Yeah, I really think it's just the cost of business. That's really what you get from being in combat. There's, you can have the best plane in the world, but if the enemy has another plane in the sky, or if they got half a dozen SAMs on the ground, then there's always that outside chance that you'll get shot down.
Mm-hmm.
And being that we only lost one F-14 to enemy ground fire in Desert Storm, and Scott O'Grady's F-16 in the war over Yugoslavia, it's still pretty impressive record. And to say nothing of the fact that both crews of both jets survived being shot down, I'd say is, I would at least consider that a win.
Yeah. And they shot down to U-2, and, so it is always possible when two combative things, the enemy gets a say, and sometimes the enemy gets to be lucky as well.
Right.
We just recently passed I think it's the 70th anniversary of Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier in the X1,
right.
The Bell X1. And I think about that and how 20 years later, these later model F series fighters are being developed or flown around and everything. It's remarkable. And now we're talking about super cruise capacity where these planes go out. The one thing I can't wrap my head around is if you're talking about fighters like the F5, I don't know, maybe that thing cost $2 million to build when it was first built, but what does a Tomcat cost and what does a F-35 cost? When you compare those, you only want so many airplanes shot out of the sky, the Navy is building ships that are more and more expensive. Like if it's $1 trillion ship and someone sinks it, it's a big problem.
Right. Yeah, it sure is. So the price tag on an F-14, depending on what variant you were looking at, it's really anywhere in the ballpark between 20 to 30 million per plane. And the F-35, I couldn't rightly tell you the price tag, but I would just take my best guess estimate and say that it's probably in the ballpark of 30 to 40 million. I mean, it has to be.
Okay.
And just when you factor in some of the developmental issues that have happened and actually getting the plane fielded and, trying to resolve some of the technical issues with the airframe itself, you're easily looking at a $50 million price tag right there.
Right. And then it seems like these modern planes are a little more fragile and harder to keep in the air because, it requires so much specific stuff. It's not just an engine and some guns. Like there's miles and miles of electronics. There's probably Bluetooth and several different, it's just got to be so much technology to keep that thing in the air. It's got to cost a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I mean, it is really not cheap to maintain these planes by any stretch.
So I saw somewhere that the F-35 was projected to stay in service to 2070. Like it was really going to be the platform for quite some time. Does that seem realistic to you? I mean, it's 2020, so 50 years from now, are we still capable of building a plane that's dominant for 50 years?
Well, I think if history is any indication, it'll probably be around for that long. I don't know if it'll be the most dominant platform, but I would wager that it would stay in service for that long. When I think about planes like the F-5 and even the F-4, I mean, F-4 Phantom hung in there for, a little over 40 years. I mean, it came online in the late 50s, had its heyday in Vietnam, but we were still using it even in Desert Storm. And I think right up until the late 90s, it was still considered an active aircraft.
Okay, let's back up and talk about what you're working on next. I mean, obviously, this book is out. Everybody should go out and buy it. Tomcat Fury, A Combat History of the F-14. And you can get that on Mike's website, MikeGuardia.com, but also on Amazon and all those kind of places. So, and remember, as always, when you buy these books, and if you're into the fighter jet thing, I mean, this is the book to buy because, what's cooler than a Tomcat? But you can interact with Mike on Twitter and Facebook. Make sure 5 stars and make sure you rate the book and review it so that everybody has a chance to find it, because that's what Amazon does, and that's how that's how they determine things. So, Mike, what's next for you once you get through promoting this book? You seem to always be on the next project. What's coming up?
Oh, yes, sir. Well, let's see. Actually, for 2020, I got 4 titles that are in the queue.
Wow.
So let's see. So for the spring of 2020, first one that's coming out is a book called Danger Forward.
Okay.
And that is a biography on a gentleman named Paul Gorman. And Paul Gorman, if any of your listeners out there are unfamiliar with that name, he was a 1950 West Point graduate, was a young platoon leader at the Battle of Pork Chop Hill in the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to Vietnam, and he's the battalion commander of 126 Infantry at the Battle of Bong Train, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership in that battle, beating back a numerically superior Viet Cong force, despite the fact that he was being burned by napalm.
Wow.
Then stays in the military after Vietnam. He becomes the principal architect of the infamous Pentagon Papers, which, really exposed the March of Folly in Vietnam for what it was.
Right.
Then in the 1980s, he is the commander of SOUTHCOM. That's the U.S. Southern Command. And he is commanding SOUTHCOM when we had troops in El Salvador, when we had troops in Nicaragua, and also when we kicked off the invasion of Grenada.
That's a hell of a life right there. Jesus.
Oh, it sure is.
Did you get a chance to chat with him and work with him directly on the book?
Sure did. As a matter of fact, he and I are still in the process of finishing up the last interviews. So that's going to be the that book, Danger Forward, is going to be the first one that's on tap for the spring. Then I have another book coming out called Days of Fury, which, if any of your listeners are familiar with the book I wrote called The Fires of Babylon, it's a companion piece to that book. In Days of Fury, I'm looking at the Battle of 73 Easting from the perspective of Ghost Troop, which is the unit that fought right alongside Eagle Troop on that battle. And then after that, I have a... It's funny we should talk about the F-15 because my next book, Wings of Fire, is a combat history of the F-15, also coming out in 2020. And then for the fall of 2020 is a book called The Combat Diaries, which is a collection of short stories from the front lines of World War II.
Wow. You are a busy guy, man. That's it's crazy to have. Is that 5 books coming out in the next 12 months? Is that right?
4, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm including Tomcat because it's just not, you're promoting it now. So is that 5 including Tomcat?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Why write 4 books in a calendar year? What makes you want to do that?
Well, really just a desire to keep the momentum going and, really try and stay sharp, try and keep my edge, figure while I got all these good stories that are bouncing around in my head, best to get them out and, keep the base of readership growing.
What draws you to Vietnam stories? Because you definitely have focused a lot of your energy there.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's almost personal. I mean, not that I have a personal connection to Vietnam in any way, but I always felt that the Vietnam War, and more to the point, the Vietnam veterans never really got a fair shake before, during, or after the conflict. And I find it to be a perennial tragedy that people seem to think that we lost in Vietnam when we not only won every battle, we essentially made the North Vietnamese cry uncle at the Paris Peace Accords. And then for our veterans to come home and be treated as miserably as they were. And then 2 years after the last combat troops leave, Congress ends up throwing South Vietnam to the wolves.
Yeah.
For me, it's almost a personal mission to try and, shine a light on the positive aspects of that conflict and, try to be, a point of light, or at least a force for good to turn the tides against the negative perceptions that have plagued that war and, moreover, plagued its veterans.
Yeah, they seem to be the most, those veterans are they're bound to each other in a way that I don't think any of the other veteran cohorts are. Obviously the modern guys, we're trying to figure out who and what we are, but
right.
the Vietnam veterans seem to just have been, when they came back more than anything else, just slammed together and just stand in a circle and dare anybody to take them on. It shocks me. And then there's Korea, which we barely even seem to care about, like in terms of movies and books. And I know there's a ton of that stuff out there, but it's just not the same. The fighting is just as hard as World War II and Vietnam. It's the same basic era. I mean, these things each happen every 10 years, it's like a different fight going on. What is it about Korea that makes it so, and I hate to say this word, but so easy to forget.
I think really it's just its relative place in history, because, on either end, you have the two big conflicts that everybody seems to remember. I mean, everybody loves World War II.
Right.
I don't think I've met anyone out there who doesn't, admire our World War II veterans. And then you have on the other side of that conflict, you have Vietnam, which, still carries a lot of negative connotations to it. And I think being sandwiched between an extreme good on one end and a perceived extreme bad on the other one just kind of leaves Korea forgotten by a lot of people.
Yeah, and I like to put things in like a time perspective, and you think about, okay, you wrap up the biggest armed conflict in human history at least that we're aware of, World War II, in 1945. 5 years later, we're in Korea having a force that ultimately is what, 250,000, 300,000 Americans strong 5 years later.
Yeah.
And I mean, these guys there's a lot of veterans from World War II. Like, yeah, I also fought in Korea. Matter of fact, Scott Husing and I met a guy who was a World War II, Korea, and Vietnam veteran. Can you imagine? For whatever reason, like you said, maybe it's just because World War II was so epic and Vietnam was so, I don't know. I guess maybe it's just the stories are just different or something. I don't know. I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me get one more question out of here, and then I'm going to let you go. What books are way out in the horizon? You're like, I really am trying. I mean, obviously, when you're writing 4 books a year, you got a lot of ideas, but there's books that you're like, I wish I could take the time to write this. What's out there that's maybe just out of your grasp?
Well, let's see. To give you a preview as to what's beyond 2020 and some books that I've actually laid the foundations for. I mean, I guess I'll just throw this out here as a preview now, but oddly enough, last time I was on the show, I remember Josh Martz was co-hosting with us, and I found out that he's a West Point graduate, class of 2005, and I've actually been laying the foundations to do a book on the class of 2005 called The Class of 9/11. Because, when you look at that West Point class, there are a lot of parallels, I think, between the class of 2005 and the class of 1966 that Rick Atkinson wrote about in his book, The Long Gray Line. Here you had the class of 2005 come into West Point during the summer of 2001. 9/11 wasn't even a blip on anyone's radar. And, a lot of the cadets we're thinking, okay, this military career, however long or short it is, I'm probably just going to be doing peacekeeping missions, a la Bosnia or perhaps Kosovo. But then at the start of what is their plebe or their freshman year, 9/11 happens, and that completely changes the dynamic. And the army that they graduate into is far different from the one that they joined. And they're having to learn how to do unconventional warfare. Counterinsurgency is once again the name of the game, and they're fighting an enemy that they weren't really trained to fight.
Yeah.
And not only that, there's a growing restlessness at home over the war in Iraq. I mean, granted, comparatively speaking, the American public wasn't as hostile towards the military as they were back in Vietnam, but the parallels are still pretty hard to ignore. And I really think that deserves a story. So, Josh and I have communicated in the background about, further fleshing out the narrative to that story.
Yeah. And I don't know if there'll ever be a class like the class of 1915, the class the stars fell on, because those guys had, World War I conflict, and also they had World War II and maybe even some Korean conflict to deal with. And so, yeah, there's a lot of generals that come out of that era. But like in our fighting, it seems like we've been so active. A guy like Josh just can't stay in. We're burning through SEALs in less than 20 years, and it's just the pace of operations is different. So how do you deal with a guy like Josh who's like, hey, I've been shot and dead once, I've had my fill, and I'm going to go do other things and clearly lead exceptionally, but from outside of the service? It's I'm interested to see what you come up with in terms of sorting through that, because it's just a neat exercise to go through and look at what careers are happening and how they're going, because these guys have been in the Army. I mean, by the time you get the book done, they'll be coming up on 20 years pretty quick,
Right.
Yeah. Well, listen, I appreciate everybody. Go get the book. It's awesome. And I'll put links to it in show notes. You can learn all about the F-14 Tomcat. And, of course, go to MikeGuardia.com to get more information on Mike and what his numerous projects are and what's coming up next. Mike, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Brother, thank you so much for having me on again. It is always a pleasure.